Sometimes the heart chooses its own path, even when the whole world stands against it. There's something deeply moving about a love that refuses to bow to tradition, especially when that love is forged in battle and tested by fire. In 9th century Norway, Ragnar the Stalwart returns from war to find the jarls demanding he marry for politics. They want him to wed a noble stranger who has never held a sword. But Ragnar's heart belongs to Freydis, the fierce Shield-Maiden who is fought beside him. She's not a delicate flower to be protected. She's a warrior who would stand with him through anything. The problem is, their entire kingdom thinks a warrior should marry for power, not love. Can their bond survive when everyone they know believes they're making the wrong choice? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, and Ragnar the Stalwart stood at the prow of his longship, watching his homeland emerge from the gray dawn. 3 months at sea had weathered his face to leather, but his eyes, those pale blue eyes that had seen too much blood and too little peace, remained as sharp as the day he'd first lifted a sword. Behind him, 30 warriors rested on their oars, their own gazes fixed on the familiar shoreline where smoke rose from the great hall's chimney, and children would soon run to greet them. This was home. This was everything they had fought for, bled for, and in some cases, died for. Yet as the wooden hull scraped against the stone pier, Ragnar felt the familiar weight settling on his shoulders, not the weight of his battle-worn axe, but something heavier. The weight of expectations. "Look at them gathering already," muttered Bjorn One-Eye from his position at the steering oar. The grizzled warrior's remaining eye crinkled with amusement as he nodded toward the shore. Word travels fast when the stalwart returns. Indeed, figures were already moving along the waterfront. Ragnar could make out the distinctive silhouettes of the jarls: Thorvald the Elder with his ornate cloak, Magnus Ironbeard whose bulk made him unmistakable even at distance, and Gunnar the Wise, whose calculating mind was probably already working through whatever schemes had been brewing in Ragnar's absence. These men had been his father's friends, his own mentors in the ways of leadership and war. Now, they were something else entirely: puppeteers who saw him as their favored marionette. But it wasn't the jarls who drew his attention. Moving through the crowd with the fluid grace of a hunting wolf came a figure that made his breath catch in his throat. Freydis Eriksdottir stood apart from the other women, her long auburn hair braided with leather cords, her hand resting naturally on the pommel of her sword. She wore no fine dress or delicate jewelry. Instead, she was clad in the practical leather and wool of a warrior, her mail shirt gleaming dully in the morning light. She had been waiting for him, not at the water's edge like the wives and mothers who would weep tears of joy and relief, but positioned where she could see everything, assess everything, protect everything if needed. It was so perfectly her that Ragnar felt his heart do something it hadn't done in months, settle into rhythm with something larger than survival. "The Shield-Maiden looks well," Bjorn observed, following his captain's gaze. There was no mockery in the older man's voice, only a certain knowing warmth. Bjorn had fought beside both of them through 7 major battles and countless smaller skirmishes. He had seen what they could accomplish together, had witnessed the unspoken communication that flowed between them like water finding its course. Ragnar stepped onto the pier, his leather boots solid against the worn stones his grandfather had helped lay decades ago. The sound of his landing seemed to release the gathered crowd from whatever spell had held them in respectful silence. Suddenly, the air filled with voices, greetings, questions about the raid, exclamations of relief at seeing the warriors return. Oh, but even as he embraced old friends and accepted congratulations on another successful venture, Ragnar was acutely aware of Freydis moving through the crowd toward him. She didn't hurry. She never hurried. but she approached with the same steady determination she brought to everything else in life, the same focus she'd shown when she'd saved his life 3 different times in foreign lands, the same quiet strength that had become as essential to him as breathing. Ragnar. Her voice carried easily over the noise, and the crowd parted naturally to let her through. You look like a man who's forgotten what real food tastes like. It was such a perfectly mundane greeting, the kind of thing any friend might say to a returning warrior. But Ragnar heard the layers beneath it. Relief that he'd returned safely, gentle teasing about his probably atrocious diet while away, and underneath it all, something warm and welcoming that had nothing to do with friendship and everything to do with the way her eyes lingered on his face, memorizing the new lines and scars he'd acquired in her absence. Freydis. He found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. You look like a woman who's been keeping our people safe while the men were away playing with swords. She snorted an inelegant sound that would have scandalized any proper lady, but which Ragnar found utterly charming. Playing? Is that what you call it when you come back with Bjorn's hair singed and Eric sporting that new scar across his ribs? Mere enthusiasm, Bjorn called out, running a hand over his indeed shortened hair. Though I'll grant you, the Saxons have gotten more creative with their fire arrows. The easy banter might have continued, but Thorvald the Elder was pushing through. The crowd now, his weathered face set in the particular expression that meant serious business. Behind him came the other jarls, and Ragnar felt the moment shift from homecoming celebration to something more formal, more fraught with implications. Ragnar Thorson, Thorvald said, using the formal address that indicated this was official, rather than personal. We're glad to see you return safely. The gods have blessed your venture, I trust. The gods in good steel, Ragnar replied, matching the formal tone. Around them, the crowd had grown quiet again, sensing the undercurrents of political maneuvering that seemed to follow every interaction between Ragnar and the Council of Jarls. Our ships carry enough silver and goods to see the settlement through. The winter with plenty to spare. Excellent. Truly excellent. Thorvald's smile was genuine, but edged with something else, anticipation, perhaps, or calculation. Such success deserves proper celebration. Tonight we feast in your honor, but tomorrow we have much to discuss. There it was, the inevitable moment when celebration gave way to expectation, when the warrior's homecoming became the community leader's burden. Ragnar had known it was coming the moment he'd seen the jarls gathered at the pier. They had plans for him, schemes, and arrangements that had been brewing in his absence like ale left too long in the sun. Tomorrow, Ragnar agreed, because there was no graceful way to avoid it. But as the crowd began to disperse and the jarls moved away to oversee the unloading of the ships, Freydis stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the familiar scent of leather oil and steel that always clung to her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. They've been busy while you were gone, she said quietly, her voice pitched for his ears alone. Lots of hushed conversations and meaningful looks. Whatever they want to discuss with you tomorrow, it's been the main topic of conversation for weeks. Ragnar felt something cold settle in his stomach. Any idea what they're planning? Nothing certain. Freydis glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then moved even closer. But I've heard whispers about alliances, about strengthening ties with the northern clans, about the importance of, she paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully, about the importance of proper marriages to bind communities together. The cold in Ragnar's stomach spread outward. He'd heard such talk before. Had seen how the jarls used marriages like trading goods, binding families and clans together through carefully arranged matches that had more to do with land and livestock than with any sort of affection or compatibility. It was the way things were done, the way they had always been done. But looking at Freydis now, seeing the quiet concern in her eyes, and remembering the 100 ways she'd proven herself not just as a warrior, but as a partner, as someone who understood him in ways no arranged bride ever could. The thought of being bound to a stranger for political convenience felt like a kind of death. "Freydis," he began, not sure what he wanted to say, but needing to say something. She shook her head slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Not here. Not now. Tonight we feast your return. Tomorrow you deal with whatever schemes the jarls have been hatching. But right now," she stepped back, her voice returning to its normal volume as other people began to drift back toward them. "Right now you need a bath, a hot meal, and probably someone to tend to that cut on your sword arm that you think you've been hiding so well." He looked down at his arm, surprised. He'd taken a shallow blade cut during their last skirmish and had thought he'd concealed it perfectly. But of course, Freydis had noticed. She always noticed when he was hurt, just as he always seemed to know when she was troubled or tired or pushing herself too hard. "It's nothing serious," he said automatically. "I'll be the judge of that." There was no arguing with that tone. He'd learned that years ago during their first campaign together. "My house, an hour after sunset. I'll have clean bandages and some of that salve your shoulder always responds to." She was already turning away when he caught her wrist gently, carefully, but firmly enough to stop her movement. For a moment they stood like that, her green eyes questioning, his hand warm against her skin where her sleeve had pulled back to reveal the intricate tattoo that marked her as a full warrior of their clan. Freydis. This time he knew what he wanted to say, but the words seemed too large, too complicated for the simple moment. "Thank you for watching over things while I was gone. He gestured vaguely at the settlement around them, the people going about their business, the sense of safety and continuity that he could feel even after months away. For all of it. Her expression softened, and for just a moment the Shield-Maiden disappeared, replaced by something more vulnerable, more personal. "You don't mean to thank me for caring about our home, about our people." A pause, so brief he might have imagined. "About you." Then she was moving away again, her warrior's confidence restored, leaving him standing on the pier with the scent of sea salt and pine in his nostrils and the weight of unspoken possibilities settling around him like a cloak. The great hall beckoned, filled with the promise of warm food and warmer fellowship. Behind him, his warriors were securing the ships and distributing the spoils of their successful raid. Around him, the settlement hummed with the comfortable rhythms of daily life, children playing, craftsmen working, elders sharing stories, and wisdom taught. This was what he'd fought for, what he'd spent 3 months away from home to protect and provide for. But as he made his way toward the hall, Ragnar couldn't shake the feeling that the real battles were just beginning. The jarls had plans for his future, and something told him those plans didn't include the Shield-Maiden, whose presence had just reminded him what it felt like to be truly home. The carved wooden doors of the great hall stood open before him, and from within came the sounds of preparation tables being arranged, ale barrels being tapped, the kitchen thralls bustling about, with the serious efficiency of people preparing for a celebration worthy of returned heroes. Soon the hall would fill with laughter and stories, with songs celebrating their successful voyage and the bonds that held their community together. But first, Ragnar paused at the threshold and let his gaze travel back toward where Freydis had disappeared among the houses and workshops of the settlement. Somewhere in that direction lay his future, not the future the jarls were probably planning for him, but the one his heart had been quietly choosing for months without his mind being willing to acknowledge it. Tomorrow would bring whatever schemes and arrangements the council had devised in his absence. Tonight there would be feasting and celebration and the comfortable weight of tradition. But later, after the last song had been sung and the last toast had been drunk, he would make his way to a small house where clean bandages and healing salve waited, along with the one person who saw him not as a political asset or a legendary warrior, but simply as a man worth coming home to. The morning came too soon and with too much ceremony. Ragnar woke to the sound of his thrall Olaf bustling about his chamber, laying out his finest tunic and polishing his ceremonial arm rings until they gleamed like captured sunlight. Through the small window, he could see that the weather had turned crisp and clear, the kind of day when important decisions were made and announcements delivered with all the weight of tradition behind them. The jarls request your presence in the great hall as soon as you've broken your fast, Olaf said without looking up from his work. The old thrall had served Ragnar's family for 30 years, and his tone carried a careful neutrality that immediately put Ragnar on edge. When Olaf went formal, it usually meant trouble brewing. Request, Ragnar repeated, sitting up on the edge of his sleeping platform. An interesting choice of words. Indeed, my lord. Olaf finally met his eyes, and Ragnar saw something there: sympathy. Perhaps a warning, though I believe the request carries the weight of expectation. Of course it did. Ragnar had hoped for a few days to settle back into the rhythms of home, to walk the boundaries of his land and check on the harvest preparations, to spend time with his warriors discussing what they'd learned on their voyage. Instead, he was being summoned to whatever grand pronouncement the jarls had prepared in his absence. The great hall felt different when he entered it an hour later. The long tables where last night's celebration had unfolded were pushed back against the walls, and in their place stood a formal arrangement of chairs facing the high seat where his father had once held court. The jarls were already positioned. Thorvald the Elder in the center, Magnus Ironbeard and Gunnar the Wise flanking him like ancient pillars of authority. But what caught Ragnar's attention wasn't the familiar sight of the council. It was the parchment scroll lying on the small table beside Thorvald's chair, its wax seal unbroken, but its presence somehow ominous in the morning light streaming through the hall's high windows. Ragnar, Thorvald rose as he approached, his weathered face arranged in an expression of benevolent authority. Come, sit. We have much to discuss. The chair they'd prepared for him faced the council directly, not beside them as an equal, but before them as one receiving judgment or instruction. It was a subtle thing, but Ragnar had grown up in halls like this, had learned to read the language of seating arrangements and formal addresses. This wasn't a discussion among equals. This was a presentation. Speak plainly, he said, remaining standing. What schemes have been brewing while I was away earning the silver that fills our coffers? Magnus Ironbeard chuckled, though the sound held no real warmth. Direct as always. Very well, we'll speak plainly. He gestured toward the scroll. An opportunity has presented itself. A chance to strengthen our position and secure our future through alliance with the northern clans. What kind of alliance? But even as Ragnar asked, he suspected he already knew. The formal setting, the careful ceremony, the way Thorvald kept glancing toward the sealed parchment, it all pointed toward one particular kind of arrangement. A marriage alliance, Gunnar the Wise said, his voice carrying the measured tone he used when delivering what he considered welcome news. Jarl Hakon of the Ironwood settlement has proposed a union between his daughter Astrid and yourself. The terms are most favorable. There it was. The trap closing with all the inexorable weight of tradition and political necessity. Ragnar felt something cold settle in his chest. Not surprise exactly. He'd known this day would come eventually, but a kind of resigned anger at the timing and manner of it. Most favorable to whom? He asked quietly. To all concerned. Thorvald leaned forward, his eyes bright with enthusiasm for his careful plans. Astrid is well-born, educated in the arts of managing a large household, skilled in weaving and herb craft. Her father commands significant resources, 200 fighting men, rich farmland, and strategic control of the northern trade routes. This alliance would double our military strength and secure our borders for a generation. And what does this paragon of domestic virtue think of being traded like a prize cow? Magnus's face darkened. That is hardly appropriate language for discussing an honorable arrangement. Forgive me. Ragnar's tone carried no apology whatsoever. What does this woman think of being married to a stranger for the sake of her father's political ambitions? She understands her duty, Gunnar said firmly. As should you. This is how alliances are forged, how communities are strengthened. Your father would have seen the wisdom in such an arrangement. The mention of his father was a calculated blow, and all four men knew it. Ragnar's father had built the prosperity they now enjoyed through exactly such strategic marriages and alliances, had taught his son that personal desires must sometimes yield to the greater good of the clan. It was a lesson that had served them well for 2 generations. But as Thorvald reached for the scroll, as the wax seal cracked under his weathered fingers, Ragnar found himself thinking not of his father's wisdom, but of green eyes and auburn hair braided with leather cords. Of a woman who understood battle and blood, who could match his strength with her own, who had saved his life and earned his respect in ways no sheltered nobleman's daughter ever could. Listen to the terms, Thorvald was saying, unrolling the parchment with ceremonial care. The marriage would take place at the harvest feast, 6 weeks hence. Astrid would bring a dowry of 50 head of cattle, 20 thralls, and claim to fertile lands north of the Ironwood River. In return, Hakon requests alliance in his disputes with the coastal raiders and, no. The word hung in the sudden silence, like a blade drawn in a peaceful room. Thorvald stopped reading mid-sentence, his eyes lifting from the parchment to study Ragnar's face with the intensity of a hunter tracking dangerous prey. No? Magnus repeated the word as if he'd never heard it before. I declined the arrangement. Ragnar kept his voice level, conversational. Send word to Jarl Hakon that I'm honored by his proposal, but cannot accept. The 3 jarls exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. This was clearly not the response they'd expected, not the reaction they'd planned. 4. Thorvald carefully rolled the scroll back up, buying time while he regrouped. Perhaps you need time to consider, he said finally. This is a significant decision, one that affects not just yourself but our entire community. Surely, I've considered. Ragnar moved to the high windows, looking out over the settlement where people were going about their daily business tending. Animals, working at crafts, training with weapons in the practice yards. I've had months at sea to think about what I want my life to look like. This isn't it. And what is? Gunnar's voice had taken on a sharp edge. What grand plan do you have that's superior to securing our borders and doubling our strength? For a moment, Ragnar said nothing, watching a familiar figure move through the practice yard below. Freydis was working with a group of younger warriors, her movements fluid and precise as she demonstrated a particular sword technique. Even from this distance, he could see the way the others watched her, with respect, with attention, with the kind of regard that had to be earned rather than inherited. I want a partner, he said finally, turning back to face the jarls. Not an ornament, or a political alliance disguised as a wife. I want someone who understands this life, who can stand beside me in whatever comes next. Ah, understanding dawned in Thorvald's eyes, and with it came a kind of weary disappointment. This is about the Shield-Maiden. It wasn't a question. Of course, they'd seen him watching Freydis yesterday, had noticed the easy familiarity between them, the way she'd tended his wounds the night before with hands that knew exactly how to touch him. In a settlement this size, few secrets could be kept for long. This is about choosing wisely, Ragnar corrected. About building something real rather than something convenient. Real? Magnus rose from his chair, his massive frame radiating disapproval. What's real is responsibility. What's real is putting the needs of your people before your own desires. What's real is understanding that leadership sometimes requires sacrifice. I've been sacrificing for years, Ragnar shot back, his own temper finally rising to match theirs. I've bled for this settlement, killed for it, spent months away from home earning the wealth that keeps it prosperous. Don't lecture me about sacrifice. Then don't act like a lovesick boy. The words exploded from Thorvald with surprising vehemence. You're not some farmer's son who can marry where his fancy leads him. You're the strongest warrior in 3 settlements, the heir to your father's position, the man everyone looks to for leadership and protection. That comes with obligations. It also comes with choices. Ragnar moved toward the door, suddenly unable to bear the weight of their expectations, their certainty that they knew what was best for everyone involved. I've made mine. The offer won't remain open indefinitely, Gunnar called after him. Jarl Hakon has other potential alliances he could pursue. If you refuse this opportunity, then we'll face whatever comes next the way we always have. Ragnar paused at the threshold, his hand on the carved wooden frame his grandfather had shaped decades ago. Together, as free people making our own choices. He left them there with their scroll and their plans and their comfortable certainty that tradition would ultimately triumph over individual will. But as he stepped out into the bright morning air, Ragnar felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of lightness, as if some burden he'd been carrying without realizing it had finally been set down. The practice yard was nearly empty now, most of the younger warriors having moved on to other duties. But Freydis remained, working through a complex series of sword forms with the focused concentration she brought to everything she cared about. Her blade caught the sunlight as it moved through the ancient patterns, and watching her, Ragnar understood with perfect clarity that he'd made the right choice. The only question now was whether she would make the same. 1. Freydis knew something had changed the moment she saw Ragnar approaching the practice yard. It wasn't just the tightness around his eyes, or the way his shoulders carried themselves like a man preparing for battle. It was something deeper, the look of someone who had finally stopped fighting against an inevitable current and decided to swim with it instead. She finished her sword form with deliberate precision, letting the familiar movement center her thoughts while she waited for him to speak. Around them, the practice yard held the lingering echoes of the morning's training session. Scuffed earth where feet had found purchase, the occasional gleam of dropped leather cord or metal fitting, the lingering scent of sweat and steel that always clung to places where warriors gathered. The jarls had their discussion, Ragnar said when she finally sheathed her blade. I gathered as much. She turned to face him fully, noting the way he stood, balanced, ready, like a man who'd made a decision and was prepared to defend it. From the look on your face, I'd say it didn't go as they expected. They want me to marry Jarl Hakon's daughter. A political alliance to strengthen our borders and double our fighting strength. He said it without preamble, the words falling between them like stones dropped into still water. I told him no. For a moment, Freydis felt the world tilt slightly, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted in some fundamental way. She'd known this day would come eventually, had seen the way the jarls watched Ragnar, had heard the whispered conversations about advantageous marriages and strategic alliances. But hearing it stated so bluntly, hearing that he'd refused, that changed everything. You told him no, she repeated, her voice carefully neutral. Just like that. Just like that. A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. Though I suspect it's far from over. Thorvald looked like a man watching his favorite plan crumble to dust. Freydis began walking toward the edge of the practice yard, needing movement to help her process what she'd just heard. Ragnar fell into step beside her, matching her pace with the unconscious synchronization that had developed between them over years of fighting side by side. This won't be simple, she said finally. The jarls have been planning this for months, from the sound of things. They won't just accept your refusal and move on to other business. I know. They'd reach the wooden fence that marked the boundary between the practice area and the pastures beyond. Ragnar leaned against the weathered rails, his gaze distant. They'll pressure me, find ways to make the alternative seem impossible or irresponsible. They'll remind me of my duties, my obligations to the settlement. They'll be right, you know. The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but Freydis didn't soften them. About your obligations. You are responsible for these people's safety and prosperity. Your marriage isn't just a personal choice. It's a political decision that affects everyone who looks to you for leadership. Ragnar turned to study her face, his pale eyes searching for something she wasn't sure she was ready to reveal. Do you think I made the wrong choice? The question hung between them like a challenge. Freydis found herself thinking of all the practical arguments, the additional warriors such an alliance would bring, the strategic advantages of controlling the northern trade routes, the simple safety that came from having powerful allies. These were real considerations, the kind of hard-headed calculations that kept communities alive in a world where strength often determined survival. But she also thought of the woman she'd be a political wife, valuable for her connections rather than her own abilities, expected to manage a household and bear children while the real decisions were made by others. The thought made something cold settle in her stomach. I think, she said carefully, that you've chosen a harder path than necessary. Harder for whom? For everyone? She pushed away from the fence, suddenly restless. For the jarls, who'll have to find other ways to secure what they want. For the settlement that might have benefited from the alliance. For you, when you have to explain to people why their safety matters less than your personal preferences. And for you? The question was quiet, but it cut straight to the heart of what neither of them had been willing to say directly. Freydis stopped walking. Around them, the normal sounds of daily life continued, cattle lowing in the distance. The ring of hammer on metal from the smithy, children's voices raised in some game or argument. The familiar soundtrack of home, of the life they'd both chosen to protect and preserve. For me most of all, she admitted finally, because now I have to decide what I'm willing to fight for. They stood in the afternoon sunlight, the weight of unspoken possibilities settling around them like morning mist. For years they danced around the edges of something deeper than friendship, something more complex than the brotherhood in arms that bound warriors together. But there had always been the comfortable assumption that circumstances would make the choice for them, that duty and tradition would eventually pull them in different directions, sparing them the difficulty of deciding what they actually wanted. Now, Ragnar had torn that comfortable assumption away, leaving them both to confront the reality of choice and its consequences. The jarls will come after you next, Ragnar said quietly. They'll try to convince you that this is folly, that I'm being selfish and irresponsible. They might even suggest that a true friend would talk sense into me. They might be right about that too. But even as she said it, Freydis knew she didn't believe it. She'd seen too much of Ragnar's character, understood too well the careful thought that went into his decisions, to dismiss this as simple selfishness. What are you really asking me, Ragnar? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd been thinking about this conversation for longer than either of them had been willing to acknowledge. I'm asking if you think it's possible to build something better than what tradition expects. If two people who've proven they can trust each other in battle might be able to trust each other in everything else. He turned to meet her eyes. I'm asking if you'd be willing to find out. It wasn't quite a proposal too careful for that, too aware of the complexities they both faced. But it was an offer, a possibility laid out for her consideration. The chance to step away from the role everyone expected her to play and help create something entirely new. The risks, she began, are considerable, he agreed, for both of us. If we're wrong about this, if we can't make it work, we'll have destroyed not just our own futures, but possibly the settlements as well. The Jarls won't forgive being defied, and other communities will see us as weak or divided. But if we're right? If we're right, we'll have proven that strength comes from partnership, not just political convenience. That the best alliances are built on mutual respect and shared values, not just strategic advantage. Freydis looked out over the settlement that had been her home for most of her life, at the people who'd accepted her as a warrior when many others wouldn't have, who'd given her the chance to prove herself worthy of their trust and respect. She thought of what she'd be risking: her position, her security, the comfortable certainty of knowing exactly what role she was expected to play. Then she thought of what she might gain: partnership instead of subordination, the chance to help, lead instead of simply following orders, the possibility of building something lasting with someone who saw her not as a convenience or an ornament, but as an equal. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This isn't just about us. There are other people to consider, other consequences to weigh." Ragnar nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "Of course." But Freydis, he caught her hand as she started to turn away. "Whatever you decide, know that asking you to consider this isn't something I do lightly. You're not a consolation prize or a comfortable alternative. You're the person I'd choose even if there were no political pressures, no expectations from anyone else." The words settled into her heart like seeds finding fertile ground. As she walked away, leaving him standing by the fence with the afternoon light golden on his hair, Freydis found herself thinking not about the risks or the practical complications, but about the simple truth he'd just offered her. She was his choice. Not his duty or his political necessity, but his actual choice. Now she had to decide if he would be hers. The carved wooden runestone lay hidden beneath Ragnar's sleeping furs, its surface worn smooth by countless hours of careful work during the long nights at sea. He'd started it without conscious intention, his hands seeking occupation during the quiet watch hours when sleep wouldn't come, and the only sounds were the creak of timber and the whisper of waves against the hull. Now, 3 days after his confrontation with the Jarls, he held it up to the lamplight and traced the intricate pattern he'd carved into the oak. Freydis' name wound through traditional knotwork, intertwined with symbols for strength, loyalty, and protection. It was the kind of thing a young man might carve for his first love, impractical and sentimental in ways that would have embarrassed him if anyone else had seen it, but it was also honest in a way that few things in his life had been lately. Soft knock at his door made him slip the stone quickly back under the furs. "Enter." To his surprise, it was Eric Bloodaxe who stepped through the doorway, his weathered face creased with the particular expression he wore when delivering unwelcome news. Eric had been his father's closest friend and remained one of the few people whose counsel Ragnar truly valued, which made his presence at this hour somewhat ominous. "Eric," Ragnar gestured toward the chair beside his sleeping platform. "You look like a man with something weighing on his mind. Several somethings, actually." Eric settled his bulk into the chair with a grunt, his graying beard catching the lamplight. "The Jarl sent me to talk sense into you. Thought an old friend might succeed where formal authority failed. And will you talk sense into me?" Eric was quiet for a long moment, studying Ragnar's face with the intensity of someone reading familiar terrain for signs of change. Finally, he shook his head with what might have been amusement. "Depends on your definition of sense, I suppose." He leaned back in his chair. "Tell me about this Shield-Maiden of yours." The directness of the question caught Ragnar off guard. He'd expected arguments about duty and responsibility, not personal inquiry. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Start with why you think she'd make a better wife than Jarl Hakon's daughter." It was a fair question, and one that forced Ragnar to articulate thoughts he'd been carrying wordlessly for months. Astrid is accomplished in the domestic arts. She can manage a household, negotiate with traders, probably produce healthy children. She's everything a traditional wife should be. But she's never held a sword in anger. Never stood in a shield wall when death was breathing down her neck. Never had to make the kind of choices that reveal who someone really is when everything they care about is at stake. Ragnar paused, remembering battles fought and won. Moments when trust between warriors had meant the difference between life and death. Freydis has done all of that. I know exactly who she is when the worst happens. Eric nodded slowly. And? Who is she? Someone who doesn't break. The words came out with more intensity than Ragnar had intended. Someone who thinks before she acts, but doesn't hesitate when action is needed. Someone who saved my life more than once and never asked for anything in return except the chance to keep fighting beside me. The jarls would say those are qualities you want in a war companion, not necessarily in a wife. The jarls think war and peace are separate things. Ragnar stood up, suddenly restless. But leadership isn't just about making decisions during battles. It's about every choice that affects the community's welfare. I want a partner who can help me think through those choices, not just someone who'll smile and manage the household while the real decisions are made by others. Freydis might feel differently about taking on such responsibilities. Being a war companion is one thing. Being the wife of a settlement leader is something else entirely. That was the question that had been keeping Ragnar awake at night. Freydis had proven herself as a warrior, had earned the respect of every fighting man in the settlement. But stepping into the role of leader's wife would mean taking on entirely different challenges. Diplomacy, household management, the complex social navigation required to maintain peace between different factions and families. She'll adapt, he said, though he heard the uncertainty in his own voice. She's always been able to learn whatever she needed to know. And if she decides the price is too high, if she chooses to remain a Shield-Maiden rather than become your political partner, the possibility was one Ragnar had been trying not to consider. Freydis valued her independence, her ability to make her own choices about where to fight and how to live. Marriage to him would inevitably constrain some of those choices, would tie her to responsibilities she'd never asked for. Then I'll have to respect her decision, he said finally. Even if it means, he stopped, unable to finish the thought. Even if it means accepting the jarl's arrangement after all. No. The word came out harder than he'd intended. No, I won't be pushed into a marriage I don't want just because the alternative is complicated. If Freydis chooses differently, I'll find another way forward. Eric leaned forward, his expression serious. And what way would that be? You can't lead this settlement as a bachelor forever. The people need to see stability, continuity. They need to know there will be heirs to carry on what you've built. It was a fair point, and one that cut to the heart of Ragnar's dilemma. Leadership in their world was intensely personal. People followed him, not just because of his skills or his father's legacy, but because they trusted him to put their welfare above his own desires. If he appeared to be acting purely from selfish motives, that trust could be damaged in ways that would take years to repair. Perhaps the people need to see that strength comes from choosing wisely, not just following tradition, Ragnar said. Perhaps it's time to show them that the best partnerships are built on mutual respect rather than political convenience. Bold words. Eric stood up, his expression unreadable. I hope you're prepared for the consequences if you're wrong. After Eric left, Ragnar pulled the carved runestone from its hiding place once more. In the flickering lamplight, Freydis' name seemed to pulse with its own life. The letters intertwined with symbols that represented everything he hoped they might build together. But hope, he was beginning to understand, was only the beginning. The real test would come in the days ahead, as the community reacted to his defiance of tradition and as Freydis herself decided whether she was willing to step into an uncertain future beside him. Outside his window, the settlement was settling into the quiet rhythms of evening. Cooking fires sent thin trails of smoke into the darkening sky, and he could hear the distant sound of voices from the great hall, where people gathered to share the day's events and plan for tomorrow's tasks. It was a good life, a prosperous life, built on the foundation his father had laid and the sacrifices countless people had made to protect and preserve it. The question was whether he could find a way to honor that legacy while also following his heart towards something that felt more authentic than anything tradition had to offer. The answer, he suspected, lay not just in his own choices, but in Freydis' willingness to help him discover what kind of future two people might build when they chose each other freely, without the weight of political necessity or social expectation. But first, she had to make that choice. And with each passing day, Ragnar was becoming more aware of how much he was asking her to risk on behalf of a future neither of them could fully envision. The ancient wedding torque lay in its wooden chest. Like a sleeping serpent, its silver surface dark with age and heavy with the weight of generations. Ragnar's grandmother had worn it, and her mother before her, each bride carrying forward the unbroken chain of tradition that bound past to future. Now it waited for the next woman who would claim the right to wear it, to take her place in the long line of wives who had helped shape their family's legacy. Ragnar stared down at the ornate metalwork, tracing with his eyes the intricate patterns that told the story of his lineage. Dragons intertwined with ravens, symbols of strength and wisdom passed down from the earliest days when his ancestors had first claimed this land. The torque wasn't just jewelry. It was a statement of belonging, a visible sign that its wearer had been accepted into the heart of the family's identity. "It's beautiful work," Freydis said quietly from beside him. He hadn't heard her approach, but her presence didn't startle him anymore. Over the past week, they'd fallen into a pattern of meeting in unexpected places. The storage rooms where weapons were kept, the quiet corners of the hall where private conversations could be held, the paths through the settlement where, too, people could walk and talk without drawing unwanted attention. "My great-grandfather commissioned it for his bride," Ragnar replied, closing the chest with deliberate care. "The smith who made it was said to be blessed by the gods, able to work silver and gold into patterns that held protective power. And it's waited all this time for your wife to wear it." There was something in her tone, not quite sadness, but a recognition of the weight that simple piece of jewelry carried. It represented not just marriage, but belonging, not just union, but acceptance into something larger than any individual choice. The jarls seemed to think Astrid would look magnificent wearing it, Ragnar said, watching Freydis' face for her reaction. They'd been quite specific about how the wedding ceremony should unfold, which traditions must be observed to ensure the gods' blessing on the union. Freydis moved away from him, walking to the small window that looked out over the settlement's main thoroughfare. Below them, people were going about their daily business, merchants setting up stalls for the morning market, children running errands for their parents, craftsmen displaying their wares in the hope of catching the attention of potential buyers. "They've thought of everything, haven't they?" she said finally, every detail planned to reinforce the message that this is how things should be done, how they've always been done. "Tradition has its own power," Ragnar admitted. "People find comfort in the familiar, in knowing that their choices are validated by the choices of those who came before them. And those who choose differently are seen as threats to that comfort." He joined her at the window, close enough to catch the scent of leather oil and steel that always seemed to cling to her hair. "Which is why this has become about more than just marriage. It's become a test of whether the community will accept change or demand conformity." Below them, a group of young warriors was assembling for training, their voices raised in the easy banter that came with shared purpose and mutual respect. Ragnar recognized most of the men who'd fought beside him and Freydis, who'd witnessed firsthand the effectiveness of their partnership in battle. "Some of them support what you're trying to do," Freydis observed, following his gaze. "Bjorn has been quite vocal about the value of choosing partners who can actually fight beside you rather than just manage your household. And others think I'm being selfish, putting my own desires ahead of the settlement's welfare." Ragnar watched as one of the younger men demonstrated a sword technique, his movements still rough but showing promise. "The division is deeper than I expected. It's not just about marriage anymore. It's about what kind of community we want to be." The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Magnus Ironbeard appeared in the doorway, his massive frame filling the space and his expression suggesting he'd come with purpose rather than casual social intent. Ragnar, Freydis. His nod acknowledged them both, but his attention focused primarily on Ragnar. "We need to talk." About? About the consequences of prolonged indecision. Magnus stepped fully into the room, his presence making the space feel suddenly cramped. Jarl Hakon sent another message yesterday. He's growing impatient with the delay and has begun exploring other potential alliances. The threat was clear. Enough. If Ragnar continued to refuse the marriage arrangement, Hakon might well decide to ally himself with their enemies instead of their friends. The northern settlements were a complex web of relationships and rivalries, and losing a potential ally could quickly become gaining an active enemy. What other alliances? Freydis asked, her warrior's instincts immediately focusing on the tactical implications. The coastal raiders have been pressing him for months, offering rich spoils in exchange for safe harbor and winter quarters. If he accepts their terms instead of ours, our northern borders become vulnerable, Ragnar finished. And we face the possibility of coordinated attacks from both sea and land. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that made the Jarl's position so compelling. Personal desires were luxury items when survival was at stake, and the harsh reality was that their settlement's security depended on maintaining good relationships with neighboring communities. "There are other ways to secure alliances," Freydis said carefully. "Trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, shared resources during difficult seasons. Marriage isn't the only tool available." Magnus turned his attention to her fully for the first time since entering the room. "And how would you propose we negotiate such alternatives? What do we have to offer that would be as valuable to Hakon as a blood tie between our families?" It was a fair question, and one that cut directly to the heart of their dilemma. Marriage. Alliances were powerful precisely because they created bonds that were difficult to break. Ties of kinship and shared interest that transcended temporary political considerations. "We offer partnership based on mutual benefit rather than obligation," Freydis replied. "We prove that our strength comes from our unity and our values, not just from the size of our armies or the complexity of our family connections." "Pretty words," Magnus said dismissively. "But Hakon is a practical man facing practical threats. He needs to know that his allies will stand with him when the raids come, not abandon him when circumstances change. And a marriage alliance guarantees that. It makes abandonment much more costly," Magnus admitted. "Blood ties create obligations that survive political disagreements." The conversation was moving in circles, each side presenting valid arguments that couldn't be easily reconciled. Ragnar found himself thinking not just about military strategy, but about the deeper question of what kind of legacy he wanted to leave. Did he want to be remembered as someone who'd maintained peace through careful political maneuvering, or as someone who tried to prove that strength could come from more authentic sources? "What if we're wrong?" he asked suddenly, the question directed as much to himself as to the others. What if choosing personal happiness over political necessity really does weaken us in ways we can't predict? "Then we'll face the consequences together," Freydis said quietly. But what if we're right? What if proving that partnerships can be built on respect and shared values actually makes us stronger than we would have been with a purely political alliance? Magnus shook his head with the weariness of someone who'd lived through too many idealistic experiments gone wrong. The problem with experiments is that failure often costs more than success is worth. Can you afford to risk everyone's safety on the chance that you might be right? It was the question that had been haunting Ragnar's sleep for days now. Leadership meant being responsible not just for his own choices, but for their impact on everyone who looked to him for protection and guidance. If his decision to follow his heart led to disaster, the blame would rest squarely on his shoulders. But as he watched Freydis' face, saw the quiet strength there that had sustained him through countless battles and challenges, he found himself thinking that some risks were worth taking, not because the outcome was certain, but because the alternative, a life built on compromise and political convenience, felt like a kind of death. The ancient wedding torque lay in its chest, waiting for whatever decision would finally be made. But increasingly, Ragnar suspected that the real choice wasn't between two different women. It was between two different visions of what strength meant and what kind of future was worth fighting to create. The battle banner hung from its place of honor in Ragnar's private chambers, its deep blue fabric bearing the silver wolf that marked his personal standard. Freydis had woven it herself during the long winter before their first major campaign. Together, her fingers working the intricate design while snow piled against the windows and the fire crackled in the hearth. She'd claimed it was simply practical. Every war leader needed a banner that could be seen across a battlefield. But Ragnar had understood even then that it represented something more. Now, as morning light fell across the banner's surface, he traced the silver threads with his eyes and remembered the battles where it had flown above their shield wall. The wool still bore faint stains from campaigns fought and won, each mark a reminder of moments when their partnership had meant the difference between victory and defeat. The scouts returned at dawn, Freydis said from the doorway, her voice carrying the particular edge that meant serious news. The coastal raiders are moving earlier than expected. 3 ships, maybe 4, heading for the northern settlements. Ragnar turned from his contemplation of the banner, his mind immediately shifting from personal concerns to tactical necessities. How long before they reach Hakon's territory? 2 days, maybe 3 if the weather holds them back. She stepped into the room, and he could see the familiar light in her eyes that came with the prospect of action. But there's more. The raiders sent envoys ahead. They're not just planning to raid and retreat. They're looking for permanent winter quarters. The implications were immediately clear. Coastal raiders who established permanent bases became more than seasonal nuisances. They became ongoing threats that could launch attacks whenever opportunity presented itself. If they succeeded in gaining a foothold in the northern territories, every settlement in the region would face constant danger. Aken will have to fight, Ragnar said, already beginning to calculate the tactical requirements. But his forces alone might not be enough to drive them off permanently, which gives us an opportunity. Freydis moved to stand beside him, close, enough that he could see the strategic wheels turning behind her green eyes. If we send warriors to help him fight off this threat, we prove our value as allies without needing a marriage to seal the agreement. It was elegantly simple, the kind of solution that cut through political complexity with direct action. Instead of negotiating terms and trading promises, they could demonstrate their worth through the most fundamental currency their world recognized: effective violence against common enemies. The jarls will argue that helping him now doesn't guarantee his loyalty later, Ragnar pointed out, though he was already warming to the idea. Without blood ties to bind the alliance, he could still choose to align himself with other powers once the immediate threat is resolved. True, but it also proves that our support is based on shared interests rather than political obligation. He'll know that we helped him because it benefited both our communities, not because we were bound by family connections to do so. Ragnar moved to the window that overlooked the main settlement, watching people go about their morning routines with the comfortable assumption that they were safe from immediate threat. That safety was always temporary, always dependent on the vigilance and strength of those who stood guard against the chaos that surrounded their small island of civilization. "It's a risk," he said finally. "If we commit warriors to Hakon's defense and the battle goes badly, we weaken ourselves for no gain. If it goes well but he still chooses to ally with the raiders afterward, we've helped strengthen a potential enemy. Everything worthwhile is a risk." Freydis joined him at the window, her shoulder brushing against his as they both looked out over their people. "But this is the kind of risk that plays to our strengths. You and I working together, leading warriors who trust our judgment, fighting alongside people who understand what we're capable of achieving." The appeal was undeniable. For months, they'd been trapped in political maneuvering and social expectations, forced to justify their choices through words and promises rather than deeds. The prospect of returning to the cleaner world of warfare, where success was measured in concrete results rather than abstract theories, felt like stepping out of a suffocating room into fresh air. "The jarls will want guarantees," Ragnar said, though he was already beginning to plan the logistics in his mind. "They'll demand written agreements about what Hakon owes us in return for military assistance. Then we give them guarantees. Not about Hakon's future loyalty, that can't be controlled anyway, but about our own effectiveness. We promise to return with either victory or information about why victory was impossible." A knock at the door interrupted their planning. Eric Bloodaxe entered without waiting for permission, his weathered face grim with the kind of news that couldn't wait for social niceties. "The jarls are meeting in emergency session," he announced without preamble. "Word about the raiders has spread, and Magnus is already talking about sending formal envoys to negotiate with them directly." Ragnar felt something cold settle in his stomach. Negotiate what? Safe passage agreements. Tribute payments in exchange for leaving our territory alone. Eric's disgust was evident in every line of his body. He argues that fighting them is unnecessary if we can simply buy their cooperation. It was the kind of short-sighted thinking that had led to the downfall of countless communities, the belief that temporary peace could be purchased with ongoing payments to those who threatened violence. Such arrangements never lasted, and they always ended with the would-be protectors demanding more while providing less protection. "That's not negotiation," Freydis said flatly. "That's surrender with extra steps." Magnus doesn't see it that way. He sees it as practical resource management better. To lose some wealth than risk losing warriors in uncertain battles. Eric looked directly at Ragnar. He's already drafting terms for the jarl's consideration. The moment of decision had arrived more quickly than Ragnar had expected, but with startling clarity. He could continue trying to navigate the political currents that surrounded his personal life, could spend more days and weeks debating marriage alliances and social expectations while real threats gathered strength. Or he could step back into the role that had always fit him, most naturally the war leader who protected his people through decisive action rather than endless negotiation. "Gather the warriors," he said, his voice carrying the particular tone that meant orders rather than suggestions. "Anyone who's willing to march north and face coastal raiders. We leave within the hour." "The jarls haven't authorized," Eric began. "The jarls can authorize or refuse after we've dealt with the immediate threat." Ragnar was already moving toward his weapon rack, his hands reaching for the familiar weight of sword and axe. "Right now, our potential ally is about to face an enemy that threatens all of us. We're going to help him, and we're going to prove that some things are more important than political convenience." "And if the jarls order you to stay?" Eric's question was quiet, but it carried the weight of understanding that this decision would have consequences far beyond the immediate military action. Then, they'll have to explain to the settlement why they chose to let raiders establish permanent bases in the north rather than support effective action to prevent it. Ragnar lifted his father's sword from its place on the wall, feeling the weight of legacy and expectation in the perfectly balanced blade. Some decisions are too important to be left to committee. Freydis was already moving toward the door, her own weapons secured and her face set with the focused intensity that came when she shifted from planning to action. I'll spread word among the Shield-Maidens. How many fighters do you want to take? Enough to make a difference. Not so many that we leave the settlement defenseless if this is a feint. Ragnar calculated quickly. 40 warriors, maybe 50. Veterans who know how to fight as a unit and trust each other's judgment. And what do I tell them about why we're really doing this? The question cut to the heart of everything they'd been discussing for weeks. This wasn't just about helping Hakon or fighting raiders. It was about proving that their partnership could be as effective in leadership as it had been in battle. That choosing each other hadn't made them weaker, but stronger. Tell them we're going to show everyone what's possible when people choose their allies based on character rather than politics, Ragnar said. Tell them we're going to win. As Freydis disappeared to gather the warriors and Eric hurried off to manage the political fallout that would inevitably follow, Ragnar stood alone with his father's sword and the banner that bore the silver wolf. In a few hours, they would be marching north toward an uncertain battle against an enemy that understood only strength. It was exactly where he belonged, exactly what he'd been trained for since childhood. But this time, he wouldn't be fighting just to protect what existed. He'd be fighting to prove what could be built when two people chose to stand together, not because tradition demanded it, but because they'd found something worth defending in each other. The hidden letter lay beneath a loose floorboard in Gunnar the Wise's private chamber, its parchment yellow with age, and its contents written in a hand that Ragnar recognized with growing shock. He discovered it by accident while searching for maps of the northern territories, but what he found instead changed everything he thought he understood about the political maneuvering of the past months. The letter was addressed to Gunnar and bore the seal of Jarl Sven the Black, leader of the coastal raiders who were even now threatening Hakon's settlement. But it wasn't a demand for tribute or a threat of violence. It was a detailed plan for destabilizing the region through carefully orchestrated political manipulation. "Read it aloud," Freydis said quietly, though her voice carried an edge that suggested she'd already guessed the general nature of what they'd discovered. Ragnar's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the parchment fully, his eyes scanning words. That refrained everything that had happened since his return from the summer raids. "To Gunnar the Wise, in recognition of our mutual interests," he began, his voice growing harder with each sentence. "The marriage alliance you had arranged between Ragnar Thorson and Astrid Hakon's daughter serves our purposes perfectly. Once Ragnar is bound to Hakon through blood ties, any military action against our forces will create division between the settlements. Ragnar's loyalty to his wife's family will conflict with his duty to protect his own people. The implications were staggering. The marriage arrangement hadn't been conceived as a way to strengthen their position against the raiders. It had been designed to weaken it, to create exactly the kind of internal conflict that would paralyze effective resistance. If Ragnar proves resistant to the marriage proposal, Ragnar continued reading, alternative arrangements should be made. Hakon has been informed that the coastal threat is more serious than it actually is, and will likely seek alliance with whoever offers the strongest support. Should Ragnar refuse the marriage, Hakon will be encouraged to seek protection from us instead, giving us the permanent base we require while turning a potential enemy into an ally." Freydis was very still, her warrior's instincts undoubtedly processing the tactical implications as quickly as Ragnar was understanding the political ones. They hadn't just been caught in a web of marriage politics. They'd been manipulated into a trap designed to either compromise their effectiveness or eliminate a potential threat to the raiders' expansion plans. "There's more," Ragnar said grimly, continuing to read from the letter. "The settlement's division over Ragnar's leadership choices serves our interests regardless of his final decision. If he marries Astrid, he becomes conflicted. If he refuses and chooses the Shield-Maiden instead, he appears to be putting personal desires above community welfare. Either outcome weakens the unity that has made his people effective opponents." The cold calculation behind the scheme was breathtaking in its scope. Sven the Black hadn't just been planning to raid and pillage. He'd been orchestrating a complex political campaign designed to turn the settlement's own values and traditions against them. "How long has this been going on?" Freydis asked, her voice carefully controlled, but with fury burning underneath. Ragnar checked the date on the letter, his stomach sinking as he realized the timeline. This was written 3 months ago. "Before I even returned from the summer raids. They've been planning this since spring, using our own jarls to do their work for them." The betrayal cut deep, not just because of its scope, but because of who was involved. Gunnar the Wise had been his father's trusted advisor, a man whose counsel had guided their community through decades of prosperity and growth. To discover that he'd been secretly working with their enemies, that the marriage pressure and political maneuvering had all been part of an elaborate trap, felt like discovering that the ground beneath his feet had never been solid. "We need to see what else is hidden here," Freydis said, already moving toward the wooden chest where Gunnar kept his most important documents. "If he's been corresponding with the raiders, there might be other letters, other plans we need to know about." They searched with the systematic thoroughness of warriors examining enemy positions, checking every hiding place and examining every document for signs of further treachery. What they found painted a picture of corruption that went deeper than either of them had imagined. There were letters detailing payments made to Gunnar in exchange for specific information about their settlement's defenses, maps marked with the locations of weapon stores and guard posts, even a detailed schedule of when their patrols would be away from the settlement, leaving it most vulnerable to attack. "He's been selling us out piece by piece," Ragnar said, staring at a letter that discussed the best times to attack their grain stores. Every bit of intelligence they needed to plan effective raids, every weakness they could exploit. He's given them everything. But it was the final letter they discovered that revealed the true scope of Sven's ambitions. Hidden in a false bottom of the document chest, it outlined plans that went far beyond simple raiding or even establishing permanent bases. The coastal raiders weren't just seeking territory. They were planning to systematically conquer every settlement in the region, using political manipulation and targeted violence to achieve what direct assault couldn't accomplish. "They're not just threats," Freydis said, reading over his shoulder. "They're an invasion force using subterfuge instead of open warfare." The letter detailed how other settlements had already been compromised, their leaders either corrupted like Gunnar or eliminated and replaced with puppet rulers who answered to Sven the Black. What was happening to their community wasn't unique. It was part of a coordinated campaign to control the entire Fjordland region without the risks and costs of traditional conquest. "This changes everything," Ragnar said, his mind racing through the implications. The marriage proposal, the pressure from the jarls, even the timing of the current raider threat. It's all been orchestrated to serve their purposes. "And Astrid?" Freydis asked quietly. "Is she part of this or another victim?" That was a question the letters couldn't answer directly, but the implications were troubling. If Håkon had been told the raider threat was more serious than it actually was, if he'd been manipulated into seeking alliances he wouldn't normally consider, then his daughter might be as much a pawn in this scheme as Ragnar himself had been. "We need to get word to her," Ragnar decided. "If she's innocent in this, she deserves to know what her marriage was really meant to accomplish. And if she's complicit, then she's as much an enemy as the raiders themselves." Freydis finished grimly, The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside made them both freeze. Ragnar quickly gathered the most damning letters while Freydis moved to the window, checking for escape routes if they needed to leave quickly and quietly. "Gunnar's returning," she whispered, recognizing the heavy tread of the older man's boots. "We need to get out of here." They slipped from the chamber like shadows, carrying with them evidence that would expose not just Gunnar's betrayal, but the entire scope of the conspiracy that had been manipulating their lives for months. But as they made their way through the settlement toward Ragnar's own quarters, both of them understood that knowledge alone wouldn't be enough. The raiders were still coming. Hakon was still facing a threat he believed was beyond his ability to handle alone, and the jarls were still expecting Ragnar to choose between his personal desires and his political obligations. The difference was that now they understood the true stakes of the game being played around them. "What do we do now?" Freydis asked once they were safely behind closed doors. The stolen letters spread across Ragnar's table like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture, more complex and dangerous than either of them had imagined. "Now we stop playing by their rules," Ragnar said, his voice carrying the particular edge that came when he shifted from reactive thinking to strategic planning. "We've been defending against moves we didn't understand, responding to threats we couldn't see clearly. But now we know who our real enemies are and what they're actually trying to accomplish." "And Gunnar?" It was the hardest question because it involved not just strategy but justice. Gunnar's betrayal had put every person in their settlement at that risk, had turned their own traditions and values into weapons to be used against them. The penalty for such treachery was traditionally death, swift and public, to serve as a warning to others who might consider similar betrayals. But executing one of the jarls without clear proof would create exactly the kind of division and uncertainty that Sven the Black wanted to exploit. They needed to be smarter than their enemies, more careful about how they responded to treachery. "We give him enough rope to hang himself," Ragnar decided. "Let him continue thinking his schemes are working while we prepare countermeasures he won't see coming. The raiders are expecting us to be divided and uncertain. Instead, we'll be united and ready." "And the marriage question?" Ragnar looked at the letters spread across his table, at the evidence of how his personal choices had been manipulated to serve enemy interests, and felt something settle into place that had been uncertain for weeks. "That question was never really about marriage," he said finally. "It was about whether we'd let others define our future or choose it ourselves. Now that we know who was pulling the strings, the choice becomes much clearer." Outside, the settlement continued its daily routines, unaware that their entire understanding of recent events was about to be turned upside down. But in this small room, surrounded by evidence of betrayal and manipulation, two people who had found each other in battle were preparing to prove that some partnerships were strong enough to survive any scheme designed to destroy them. Ragnar's father's sword lay across his knees as he sat in the great hall, its ancient steel catching the firelight while he considered the weight of generations pressing down upon this moment. The blade had been forged 3 centuries ago by a master smith whose name was lost to time, but whose skill lived on in the perfect balance of the weapon and the intricate runes etched along its fuller. Each mark told a story victories won, oaths sworn, the unbroken line of warriors who had carried this steel into battle and emerged victorious. Now it would either continue that legacy or mark the end of everything his family had built. The hall was fuller than it had been in months, every bench occupied by warriors, craftsmen, elders, and their families. Word of the discovered letters had spread through the settlement like wildfire, and the evidence of Gunnar's treachery lay displayed on the high table where everyone could see it. The parchments seemed to glow in the lamplight, their damning words having already transformed how everyone understood the events of recent months. "The question before us isn't complex," Ragnar said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the hall. We've learned that our enemies have been using our own traditions against us, turning our values into weapons to weaken us from within. Now we must decide how we respond to that knowledge. Thorvald the Elder sat rigid in his chair, his weathered face showing the strain of having discovered that one of his closest colleagues had been working with coastal raiders. Magnus Ironbeard looked like a man who'd swallowed something bitter, his usual bluster replaced by careful calculation as he processed the implications of what they'd learned. But it was Gunnar the Wise who drew most eyes in the hall. The traitor sat in chains, his face an expressionless mask that revealed nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind his calculating eyes. Even caught red-handed with evidence of his betrayals, he showed no remorse, no shame, only the cold assessment of a man still looking for angles to exploit. "Speak, Gunnar," Ragnar commanded, though his tone carried no expectation of truth. "Tell your people why you chose to serve our enemies instead of protecting those who trusted you." For a long moment, the old jarl said nothing. Then, slowly, he lifted his head to meet Ragnar's gaze with something that might have been defiance or might simply have been the pride of a man who'd played a complex game and lost. "I chose survival," he said finally, his voice carrying no apology. "Sven, the Black commands 500 warriors and a dozen ships. He has gold enough to buy loyalty where he cannot compel it, and the will to use whatever methods serve his purposes. You have 40 fighters, and the stubborn pride of people who think honor matters more than practical results. And you decided. We were on the losing side. I decided that accommodation was preferable to annihilation." Gunnar's chains clinked as he shifted in his chair. "When the choice is between serving new masters or watching everything you've built burn to ash, wise men choose service." "Wise men," Freydis said from her position beside Ragnar's chair, "find ways to win rather than ways to surrender gracefully." Her presence there, standing where traditionally only family members would stand during formal proceedings, had not gone unnoticed. Some in the hall had muttered about the appropriateness of a Shield-Maiden taking such a prominent role in community judgment. But others, particularly the younger warriors who'd fought beside both of them, had nodded approval at seeing partnership acknowledged publicly. "Easy words from someone who's never faced impossible odds," Gunnar replied, his tone dismissive. "But we'll see how wise your defiance proves when Sven's ships darken the fjord and his warriors scale our walls." "Perhaps," Magnus Ironbeard said heavily, "it's time we discussed exactly what we're facing." The big man rose from his chair, moving to the table where they'd spread maps of the region alongside the captured correspondence. His finger traced the coastline as he spoke, marking locations that had taken on new significance in light of what they'd learned. According to these letters, Sven has already secured winter quarters at 3 different settlements. His forces aren't scattered raiders anymore. They're a coordinated army with permanent bases and reliable supply lines. Magnus paused, his expression grim. Worse, he's been recruiting local fighters who've chosen to serve him rather than resist. "How many total warriors does he command?" asked Eric Bloodaxe, the old warrior's tactical mind immediately focusing on the practical considerations. The letters suggest 700, possibly 800 fighting men, well-armed, well-supplied, and experienced in both raiding and siege warfare. Magnus looked around the hall, making sure everyone understood the stark mathematics they faced. "Against our 40 warriors, plus whatever force Hakon can muster if he hasn't already been compromised." The numbers were sobering, but Ragnar had expected as much once they'd understood the true scope of Sven's ambitions. No simple raider could have orchestrated the kind of political manipulation they'd uncovered. It required resources, organization, and strategic thinking that suggested a much larger operation than seasonal coastal raids. Numbers aren't everything. Bjorn One Eye called out from his place among the warriors. "We know this land, know how to use the terrain to our advantage. And we'll be fighting for our homes while they're fighting for profit. True, Freydis agreed, moving to stand beside the map table. But we can't win through defensive fighting alone. If Sven has permanent bases and reliable supply lines, he can simply wait us out, wearing down our resources while his remain constant. She traced her finger along the fjord, indicating the narrow passages that controlled access to their settlement. We need to disrupt his logistics, force him to fight on our terms rather than his. Make the cost of conquest higher than the potential rewards. And how do you propose we do that? Thorvald asked, his tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than challenge. Our entire force barely numbers 50 fighters. By using what they don't expect, Ragnar said, finally rising from his chair with his father's sword still in his hand. They've planned for traditional responses, either submission or direct resistance. They haven't planned for a coordinated campaign designed to turn their own strategies against them. He moved to join Freydis at the map table, and together they began outlining a plan that had been taking shape in both their minds since they'd first understood the true nature of the threat they faced. Sven's strength comes from having multiple bases and supply lines, Freydis explained, her finger tracking the coastal positions marked on the map. But that same dispersal becomes a weakness if we can strike at his logistics faster than he can respond to defend them. Hit-and-run attacks on his supply convoys, Eric nodded, following their reasoning. Force him to dedicate warriors to guard duties instead of offensive operations. Exactly. And while his forces are scattered trying to protect everything, we coordinate with Håkon and any other settlement leaders who haven't been compromised. Instead of facing his full strength in set battles, we force him to fight multiple smaller engagements where our knowledge of local terrain gives us advantages. Magnus studied the map with the intensity of someone visualizing complex military movements. It could work, he admitted finally, but it requires perfect coordination between multiple forces and assumes that Håkon and the others can be trusted. That's where the marriage alliance becomes useful, Ragnar said, and felt the attention in the hall focus on him with laser intensity, not as political submission, but as intelligence gathering. If Astrid is innocent in this conspiracy, she becomes our source of information about her father's true situation. If she's complicit, we learn that too. You're still planning to marry her? The question came from somewhere in the crowd, voiced with surprise and confusion. I'm planning to let Sven think I'm marrying her, Ragnar corrected. The wedding ceremony becomes an opportunity to gather intelligence, identify which other settlement leaders have been compromised, and position our forces for maximum effectiveness when we strike. The brilliance of it was its simplicity. Sven's entire strategy depended on political manipulation and division within their communities. By appearing to go along with the marriage while actually using it as cover for military preparation, they could turn his own methods against him. And after the ceremony? Thorvald asked quietly. What happens to the girl when she realizes she's been used as bait? It was Freydis who answered, her voice steady and sure. She makes the same choice everyone else makes to stand with those who fight for freedom or serve those who would destroy it. But she makes that choice with full knowledge of what's actually at stake. And if she chooses poorly, then she faces the same consequences as any other enemy, Ragnar said simply. But I suspect that once she understands how she's been manipulated, her choice will be clearer than anyone expects. The plan was dangerous, complex, and dependent on dozens of variables they couldn't fully control. But as Ragnar looked around the hall at faces that reflected determination rather than despair, he felt something he hadn't experienced since learning of Gunnar's betrayal hope. We have 3 days to prepare, he announced, sliding his father's sword into its sheath with deliberate ceremony. 3 days to gather supplies, coordinate with allies we can trust, and position ourselves for a campaign that will either secure our freedom or see us die fighting for it. And the marriage? Magnus asked. Ragnar looked at Freydis, seeing in her green eyes the same resolve that had carried them through countless battles. The marriage ceremony proceeds as planned, but instead of binding me to political compromise, it becomes the first move in a campaign to prove that some partnerships are strong enough to overcome any scheme designed to destroy them. The hall erupted in voices as people began discussing logistics, assignments, and the 100 practical details that would determine whether their plan succeeded or failed catastrophically. But through the noise, Ragnar heard something that had been missing from their community for weeks. The sound of people working together toward a common goal. United in purpose rather than divided by manipulation, tomorrow would bring the final preparations. In 3 days, they would discover whether love and loyalty were stronger than fear and political convenience. But tonight, surrounded by his people and standing beside the woman who had become his partner in everything that mattered, Ragnar felt ready for whatever battles lay ahead. The twin battle rings gleamed in the pre-dawn light, their silver surfaces engraved with matching runes that spoke of partnership forged in fire and sealed in blood. The settlement smith had worked through the night to complete them, his hammer ringing against anvil, while the rest of the community prepared for what might be their final day of freedom. Ragnar held one of the rings up to catch the first rays of sunlight, watching how the light played across the intricate knotwork that bound his name to Freydis in patterns that would endure long after flesh had returned to earth. They weren't wedding rings in any traditional sense. They were something new, symbols of a partnership that transcended the usual categories of marriage and military alliance. "They're beautiful," Freydis said softly, taking the second ring from the smith's weathered hands. "And they'll be visible to everyone on the battlefield." That was the point. When the fighting began, and it would begin today. Regardless of how the morning ceremonies unfolded, every warrior needed to understand exactly where loyalties lay, and who could be trusted to stand firm when death came calling. The wedding preparations had proceeded exactly as planned, but beneath the familiar rituals of feast-making and ceremonial arrangement, a different kind of preparation had been taking place. Weapons had been sharpened and hidden within easy reach. Messages had been sent to settlements whose leaders remained untainted by Sven's corruption. Most importantly, they'd received word from Astrid herself, a message that had arrived during the night and changed everything they thought they knew about Hakon's daughter. "She knows," Ragnar said, thinking of the brief letter that had been smuggled to them by a loyal thrall. About her father's situation, about Sven's manipulation, about what the marriage was really meant to accomplish. "And she's choosing to help us." Freydis nodded, strapping on her mail shirt with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. "The question is whether we can trust her choice. People under pressure sometimes make promises they can't keep when the actual moment arrives." It was a fair concern. Astrid's message had been brief and necessarily vague, but it suggested she'd discovered her father's correspondence with the raiders and understood how she'd been positioned as a pawn in their scheme. More importantly, it indicated she was willing to help expose other compromised leaders who would be attending the wedding ceremony. "We'll know soon enough," Ragnar replied, settling his own battle gear into place. "But her information about which jarls can still be trusted has already proven accurate. 3 settlements have sent warriors to support us, all because she provided the contact information we needed." The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the settlement's main gate, where the first wedding guests were already arriving. From their position near the Great Hall, they could see the colorful banners and fine clothing that marked this as a celebration. But Ragnar's experienced eye also noted the number of armed escorts each party brought and the way those warriors positioned themselves for quick action rather than ceremonial display. "Sven's people," Freydis observed, watching a group of well-dressed men dismount near the hall's entrance. "I count 12 of them, all wearing swords despite the supposed festive nature of the occasion." And there, Ragnar pointed toward another group just entering the settlement's boundaries. Those are Hakon's men, but notice how they're staying separate from the others. If Astrid told the truth about her father's situation, he's brought only warriors he's certain haven't been corrupted. The morning air carried the familiar sense of cooking food and festival preparation, but underneath those peaceful aromas lay something else. The metallic tang of oiled steel and the particular tension that always preceded battle. Every person moving through the settlement understood that today's celebration might become today's battlefield, and they were prepared for either possibility. The ceremony begins in an hour, Freydis said, checking the position of the sun against the mountains. Whatever happens next, we need to be ready to move quickly. Ragnar slipped the battle ring onto his finger, feeling its weight settle against his skin like a promise made tangible. Beside him, Freydis did the same, and for a moment they stood connected by more than just shared purpose. They were bound by choice, by the decision to stand together regardless of what others expected or demanded. No matter what happens during the ceremony, he said quietly, remember that everything we've done has been to reach this moment. All the preparation, all the risk, all the careful planning, it all comes down to the next few hours. I know. Her voice carried the calm certainty that had steadied him through countless battles. And I know that whatever we face it together. The great hall's doors stood open, revealing the gathering crowd of wedding guests who would soon witness either a celebration of political alliance or the beginning of a war that would determine the future of every settlement in the region. Hidden among the festive decorations were weapons and warriors, positioned to turn celebration into battlefield at a moment's notice. Above them, the settlement's watchtowers were manned by their most trusted fighters, ready to signal the approach of any additional forces that might complicate the day's events. Below, in the hall itself, the high table had been arranged to provide clear sight lines for anyone who might need to assess threats quickly. Everything was ready. The only question remaining was whether their enemies understood how thoroughly their own schemes had been turned against them, or whether Sven's confidence in his political manipulation would blind him to the military trap that had been prepared. In its place, the battle rings caught the morning light one final time as Ragnar and Freydis made their way toward the great hall, where destiny waited in the form of a wedding ceremony that would decide far more than any marriage could ever encompass. The settlement's victory horn had never been blown by a woman's lips before, but as Freydis raised the ancient instrument to sound the call of triumph across the fjord, no one questioned her right to claim that honor. The deep, resonant note echoed off the surrounding mountains, carrying news of victory to settlements that had been waiting anxiously for word of the day's outcome. The great hall behind her bore the scars of sudden battle, overturned tables, scattered wedding decorations stained with blood, and the bodies of Sven's agents who had thought they were attending a political ceremony rather than walking into a carefully prepared trap. The wedding feast had lasted exactly long enough for Astrid to identify which guests were loyal to her father and which served the coastal raiders. And then the celebration had transformed into something far more decisive. Sven himself is dead, Ragnar reported, approaching with his father's sword still dark with the blood of their primary enemy. He made the mistake of thinking political manipulation was a substitute for warrior skill. The raid leader's confidence in his schemes had proven to be his downfall. When Astrid had publicly revealed the extent of his conspiracy during what should have been the marriage ceremony, Sven had tried to salvage the situation through immediate violence. But he brought only a dozen fighters to what he'd expected to be a peaceful political event, while Ragnar and Freydis had prepared for war, and his remaining forces scattered or surrendered. Ragnar gestured toward the harbor, where several of Sven's ships sat under guard by their own warriors. Without their leader and cut off from their supply lines, most chose practical survival over pointless resistance. Freydis lowered the victory horn, its final echoes fading into the afternoon air. Around them, the settlement was already beginning the work of cleaning up from the brief but decisive battle. The victory had been complete enough that casualties among their own people were minimal, a few wounded, but no deaths among those they'd sworn to protect. Hakon fought well, she observed, watching the northern jarl directing his men in securing the captured raiders. Whatever doubts he had about which side to support, they disappeared quickly enough once the fighting started. His daughter's courage helped with that. Ragnar's respect for Astrid was evident in his voice, standing up in front of everyone to expose Sven's conspiracy that took the kind of strength that doesn't come from comfortable living. Indeed, Astrid had proven herself worthy of admiration in ways that went far beyond her value as a political alliance. When the moment had come to choose between serving her father's supposed interests and revealing the truth about the manipulation they'd all been subjected to, she'd chosen truth with a clarity that had stunned everyone present. "She makes some settlement a fine leader someday," Freydis said, "though probably not as anyone's decorative wife. No, she's learned the same lesson we have, that partnerships built on mutual respect accomplish more than arrangements based on political convenience." The sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention to where Magnus Ironbeard was approaching, his massive frame somehow diminished by the day's revelations about how thoroughly they'd all been manipulated. Behind him came Thorvald the Elder, whose weathered face showed the strain of learning that one of his oldest colleagues had been working with their enemies. "The Jarls want to discuss the future," Magnus announced without preamble. "Now that the immediate threat is resolved, decisions need to be made about leadership, about alliances, about how we prevent something like this from happening again, and about marriage arrangements that were made under false pretenses," Thorvald added, his eyes moving between Ragnar and Freydis, with something that might have been understanding or might simply have been exhaustion. Freydis felt Ragnar's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining with the easy naturalness that had developed between them over years of fighting side by side. The battle rings on their hands caught the late afternoon light, symbols of a partnership that had been tested by conspiracy and proven stronger than any scheme designed to destroy it. "The marriage question was settled during the battle," Ragnar said calmly. "When Freydis and I fought as partners to protect our people, when our coordination and trust enabled victory against superior numbers, when our unity became the foundation for everyone else's courage, the traditional ceremonies," Magnus began, "can be observed or adapted as needed," Freydis interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who just helped save their entire community. "But the essential bond was forged years ago in battle and confirmed today in victory. What we choose to call it matters less than what we've proven it can accomplish." Around them, the settlement was returning to the rhythms of daily life, but with a difference. People moved with the confidence that came from having faced a serious threat and emerged victorious. Children who had hidden during the brief battle were now playing among the scattered decorations, turning the remnants of interrupted celebration into toys for their games. "There will be other threats," Thorvald said quietly. "Other enemies who'll test our unity in different ways." "Yes," Ragnar agreed. "But now we know that strength comes from choosing our partners wisely, from building alliances based on shared values rather than political convenience. And we know that when people are free to choose their own paths, they choose more courageously than when they're forced into arrangements that serve others' interests." The victory horn lay silent now, its work completed. But the echoes of its call would spread throughout the Fordlands, carrying news that would reshape how other communities thought about leadership, partnership, and the courage required to choose authentically in a world that often rewarded political compromise over personal truth. As the sun began to set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Freydis and Ragnar stood together. At the threshold of a future they had chosen freely, defended successfully, and earned through the kind of partnership that no amount of political manipulation could ever hope to destroy. The new hall beam stretched across the grate, all ceiling like a bridge between past and future, its fresh carved surface bearing the intertwined names of Ragnar and Freydis, surrounded by symbols that spoke of partnership, protection, and the courage to build something entirely new. The settlement's master carpenter had worked for weeks on the intricate design, and now it stood as both structural support and enduring testament to the idea that love, when tested by fire, could become the strongest foundation for any community. 3 months had passed since the battle that ended Sven's conspiracy, and the changes ran deeper than anyone had initially expected. What had begun as a personal choice between duty and desire had evolved into a transformation of how their entire community understood leadership, partnership, and the relationship between individual happiness and collective welfare. The harvest has been exceptional, Freydis reported, reviewing the tallies that had just come in from the outlying farms. Better than anything we've seen in the past 5 years. Having our neighbors as genuine allies rather than political necessities has made cooperation much more effective. Ragnar nodded, though his attention was focused on the letter that had arrived that morning from settlements throughout the Fjordlands. Word of their successful resistance to Sven's manipulation had spread quickly, and other communities were beginning to question their own political arrangements, looking for signs of similar corruption and asking for advice about building more authentic alliances. Jarl Eriksson wants to arrange a marriage between his son and the daughter of Jarl Olsen, he said, summarizing the morning's correspondence. But instead of negotiating terms through intermediaries, he's proposing that the young people meet. First, spend time together. See if they can build the kind of partnership that makes political sense rather than just accepting what makes political convenience. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it represented a fundamental shift in thinking that was spreading throughout the region. People were beginning to understand that the strongest alliances grew from genuine mutual respect rather than contractual obligation, and that partnerships built on shared values could weather storms that would destroy relationships based purely on political necessity. And Astrid? Freydis asked, settling into the chair beside Ragnar's at the high table. How is she adjusting to her new responsibilities? Thriving, from all accounts. Ragnar smiled, remembering the young woman who had found her courage at exactly the moment it was most needed. Hakon has formally named her as his heir, and she's proven to have a natural talent for the kind of diplomacy that builds genuine cooperation rather than temporary convenience. Astrid had indeed surprised everyone, including herself. Released from the burden of being a political pawn, she discovered abilities that no one had expected, and a strength of character that would serve her people well in the years to come. Her willingness to risk everything to expose Sven's conspiracy had earned her a reputation for integrity that made other leaders eager to work with her. She sent word that she's considering several suitors, Freydis added with amusement, all of whom she specifies must be willing to prove themselves as partners rather than simply presenting credentials as potential husbands. The changes weren't limited to political arrangements. Throughout the settlement, people were approaching their personal relationships with new thoughtfulness, asking different questions about what made partnerships successful and what kind of future they wanted to build together. The Shield-Maidens had gained new respect, not just as warriors but as examples of what women could accomplish when their abilities were valued rather than constrained by traditional expectations. Eric's daughter is asked to train with weapons, Ragnar mentioned, thinking of the conversation he'd had with his old friend just that morning. Eric himself suggested it, said he'd rather have a daughter who could defend herself than one who depended entirely on others for protection. And young Olaf wants to learn textile work alongside sword training. Freydis gestured toward the far end of the hall, where several young people were engaged in various crafts and training activities. He says that understanding how to create useful things is as important as knowing how to destroy enemies. These small changes in how they thought about strength, skill, and gender roles were creating ripple effects throughout their community. Children were growing up with different expectations about what they might become, and adults were discovering talents they'd never been encouraged to develop. The real test will come with the next generation, Ragnar observed, watching a group of children playing a game that seemed to involve both mock combat and collaborative building. They're learning to think about partnership and leadership in ways we're still figuring out ourselves. They'll do better than we have, Freydis said with quiet confidence. They're starting with different assumptions about what's possible, different models of how strength and cooperation can work together. The afternoon light slanted through the hall's windows, illuminating the new beam with its carved testament to the power of choice freely made and defended successfully. Around them, the settlement hummed with the productive energy of people who understood that their individual choices contributed to collective strength, that personal authenticity and community welfare could support rather than contradict each other. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd simply accepted the jarl's original plan, Ragnar said thoughtfully. If we'd gone through with the political marriage, tried to make the best of an arrangement designed to serve others' interests, we'd have spent our lives wondering what we might have accomplished if we'd had the courage to choose differently, Freydis replied. And we'd never have discovered that some partnerships are strong enough to change not just individual lives, but entire communities. Above them, the carved beam stretched across the hall like a promise made visible, its intertwined patterns speaking of love that had grown stronger under pressure, of choices that had created new possibilities, and of the courage required to us build something authentic in a world that often rewarded political convenience over personal truth. As the day settled into evening, and the hall began to fill with people gathering for the evening meal, Ragnar and Freydis remained at the high table, partners in leadership as they had been partners in battle. Proof that when two people choose each other freely and defend that choice courageously, they can create a foundation strong enough to support not just their own happiness, but the hopes of everyone who looks to them for protection and guidance. The new beam would outlast them both, carrying their intertwined names into a future they had helped create through the simple revolutionary act of refusing to let others define what their love should look like or accomplish. And in settlements throughout the Fjordlands, other couples would look up at similar beams and understand that strength, when shared authentically, became something greater than either person could achieve alone.